best part of every conference we attend is when I get to sit down with Kristine Werner Ozug, somebody who's part of the RealTalk MS team, somebody who lives with MS, and somebody who has been here at the ACTRIMS forum, going through all the sessions, meeting all of the experts, and I think it's always a great opportunity to get the perspective of someone who's living with MS, because frankly, at these conferences, for one reason or another, there are very, very few patients in the room. So Kristine, what did you see?
I'll start off by saying the theme of the conference is MS at a crossroads, and we kind of talked about what that means. And I thought about that, and to me it means we can see that research is moving in this direction of no longer treating MS relapses. That the science is evolving to look at things like neuroprotection and stopping progression and trying to stop it earlier, and also looking at treating the entire person and not just what an MRI might show. And I also think that science is evolving to look along the entire MS continuum, and that in this conference it was particularly interesting because we saw presentations that were including pediatric onset MS all the way to looking at older adult onset MS. So along the entire MS continuum, but also across the entire MS population, which I thought was really interesting.
So we have a lot of people who are watching who are sitting at home with relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive, and at least a few of them are probably wondering, what do you mean when you say MS continuum?
We're gonna go and jump right into it, aren't we? So, yeah. We had a whole session and panel discussion on the MS continuum, if you will, or what we've been talking about these past couple of years or so are MS course descriptors, which you just listed, or clinical course descriptors, or what people know as these categories that they fit into. And the discussion today again brought up, are these still fit for purpose today? And the science, the more we find out about MS and the biology of it and the pathophysiology of it and different biomarkers, not only on MRI, but also serum biomarkers, CSF biomarkers, and also taking into consideration what people like me are coming into their appointments saying. I know you're saying my MRI is okay, but I feel like I'm getting worse. And so taking all of this into consideration, what would new clinical course descriptors look like, and what would they include, like biomarkers and such, to track progression, and how would people fit into these new course descriptors, and how would clinicians have those discussions with people like me?
I think the labels that get used today, that have been used for the last 30 years, they really relate to clinical presentation, how someone physically is when they walk into that neurologist's office, how fast they can do their 25-foot walk, what their 9-hole peg test looks like. All of these factors come into play to determine which bucket you're going to be included in. But as you just pointed out, there are other things happening, things that are happening in the central nervous system that may indicate a very slow but steady kind of progression, for instance, that maybe gets turned off so often and then gets turned back on so often, and that's wholly separate from the inflammatory activity that takes place that today's DMTs are very good at trying to manage. So yes, to your point, I think relapsing MS can largely be managed. Secondary progressive gets really tricky because you only tend to see or to be able to label secondary progressive MS retrospectively after someone has exhibited a different set of symptoms, a worsening that they hadn't displayed before. So nobody can walk into their doctor's office and show them that they have secondary progressive MS unless that doctor's been following them a long time, and then he or she can make their own determination. But it still comes down to sort of looking in the rearview mirror, and does that really offer the best kind of care for someone who's living with MS? I think the science is getting to the point where we can do better now, and that's why we've, I think, seen some of the presentations we've seen and heard some of what we're hearing lately about perhaps coming up with new ways to describe MS. What else caught your eye here?
Well, for what you were just talking about, it just reminded me of two things. One, when Dr. Dan Antoneda presented, he kind of showed what you were talking about. We have this relapsing kind of inflammatory process that goes on. And then we also have this neurodegenerative progressing process that goes on. And they can go on independently of each other, but they also can overlap and go on at the same time. So like both can be true. And that is, I think, the tricky part. And like you said, we have the DMTs to treat the one, but we're not so great at treating the other. And I think they're still trying to figure out why some people have one, not the other, or why some people can have both. Or is it also age? We saw some presentations on age, and with aging comes reduced ability to be able to myelinate on your own and reduce neuroplasticity. And because I think all of these mechanisms and immunology becomes an issue as well, because all of these things are so complex, it's not so easy to get a biological and pathophysiological framework quickly. And we want to be able to measure. So what's the best way to measure these things? And that's where we talk about things like serum neurofilament light chain. We've talked about the GFAP, and there's other protein biomarkers that we heard about. But again, they're not ready to be used in the clinical setting. But this is all very exciting because we're moving toward, I think, being able to track progression and also maybe start looking at, is somebody starting to progress? So we can start to treat that and also open up new therapeutic targets for progression, which is what our Brancic Prize winner for Innovation in MS Research, Manuel Frisa, he was awarded that for his work on the inflammation processes in neurons and the impact that has on death or neurodegeneration. And that's very important for us to understand because that's what really starts to drive progression.
Well, I think what Dr. Frisa really uncovered in his work is the new concept that when nerve cells are under attack from inflammation during an MS relapse, for instance, they're not passive victims of that attack. Those nerve cells want to fight back and against the demyelinating attack. And so I think, as you pointed out, that represents a new way of thinking about how to stop that inflammatory activity, how to beat that demyelinating attack and allow those nerve cells to survive, which means we limit the amount of damage, which means we limit the amount of progression, which means we limit the amount of disability. So yeah, I think all these things, where they're headed, I think is, toward a more personalized approach, because as we can define MS by the different biological mechanisms that are taking place in an individual, you treat those processes, which may be different than what's happening to the next person who's in the waiting room in that neurologist's office. And so it opens a door to really creating personalized treatment plans that are going to stop MS for that individual, slow progression, stop progression, and in many cases, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves in the future, but the next step is myelin repair and being able to restore some of the function that's already been lost.
Right.
Somebody described it to me today as we're on the cusp of a lot of really, really good things.
Yes, and that was also the thought I had about us being at this crossroads, or as when you and I were talking, is it more of an inflection point? Because we are on the cusp, I think, of so many things really converging at the right time to be able to make all of these exciting changes and treatments, and with the course descriptors and the biomarkers and the new treatments to stop or slow progression. And I feel like we're almost there, and we can keep going with this work and just really make a difference in the lives of people living with MS and their families and everything. So it's always very exciting to hear the work that's being done.
So you may have answered the question I'm about to ask you, but you have a big takeaway from this conference?
I think that people are working very hard, and they're working very hard on the right things. Everybody knows that progression is an unmet need, and particularly with some results we heard today at the end of the late-breaking abstracts, we heard an update on some results. They're not final on the frexalimab trial, which seems promising so far, but it's still early days. And then we did hear on the fenebrutinib trial, phase 3 for primary progressive MS. And if that pans out, it's the first time in more than a decade that we could have a new drug for primary progressive MS, because right now we have Ocrevus. And I applaud that trial. It was a very brave trial, a landmark trial in my opinion, that they tested that BTK inhibitor against Ocrevus, and they had good outcomes. 12% risk reduction in disability, and another outcome that wasn't specifically a trial endpoint, but I still think a very good outcome in the 9-hole peg test. They had a 26% risk reduction in progression compared to Ocrevus, which is important for hand function and dexterity. So that was a big takeaway for me, and the hope for people that live with primary progressive MS.
Well, it's funny, your big takeaways are the same as mine. So I'll see you in a few months at the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting.
That sounds great.